Outside of Carbondale, Illinois, on a narrow dirt road which went straight through the countryside, I navigated my Model T with careful precision. Each pothole and crack in the road sent jolts through the sturdy frame of the vehicle, reminding me of its solid build and the absence of power steering. The struggles of motor coaching were a testament to the ruggedness of life in 1924. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, muscles straining against the resistance as I maneuvered around the obstacles in my path. The warm spring air whipped through the open area where someday windows would evolve, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth and budding wildflowers. It was a beautiful day, but the rough terrain demanded my full attention. My name is Caden Parks, and at 24 years old, I was still adjusting to the responsibilities of adulthood. Only 2 years out of law school, and my career had already begun to blossom, thanks to what some called my brilliance. Mr. Fitch, the senior partner at the firm where I worked, offered me a partnership. I tricked myself into believing it was a testament to my hard work and dedication. But at the end of the day, I saw his maneuver for what it was. He wanted to keep me close. He saw how dangerous I could be if left alone. He didn't want me running wild as the competition. I had no desire to hurt anyone on this path, but I also wasn't going to stop myself from becoming what I was meant to become. As I bounced along the road, my thoughts turned away from my professional success and to the family who took me in when I was a lost 17-year-old who wandered across town to fatefully land at their door. The Wood family welcomed me into their home with open arms, offering me a place to stay and a sense of belonging when I had nowhere else to turn. I remembered the day I arrived. Cold, hungry, lost, alone. They took pity on me, though most people at the time would consider me a grown man who should do for himself, and not the lost child I was. They saw the vulnerability and uncertainty which consumed my strength. I don't think I'd be alive at any time if it weren't for them. Over time, our bonds deepened. But it was their middle child, Joe, who captured me from the very beginning. With his easy smile and mischievous glint in his eye, he drew me in, leaving me yearning for more with each passing day. As I continued down the dusty road, my mind wandered back to the moments we shared. The stolen glances, the fleeting touches which spoke volumes without a single word. I knew right away my feelings for him went beyond friendship, beyond the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in our society. But out of respect for his parents, I always took things slow with him. We kept our relationship to ourselves behind closed doors, and usually didn't display much in front of his family, although they all knew what was going on. In the privacy of my own thoughts, I allowed myself to dream of a future where such constraints did not exist. A future where I could openly declare my love for him without fear of judgment or condemnation. Not that his family would ever react badly, but I yearned for a time we could be comfortable being ourselves. As I navigated across the landscape, I vowed to do whatever it took to make this dream a reality. As soon as I pulled the brake and killed the power, the distant sound of horse hooves reached my ears. Although in this era most people still preferred horses over automobiles, I knew without a doubt who it was. Closer the noise came, until I could see Joseph Wood astride the horse. His expression was as determined as ever. I knew he would know where and when to find me. I wanted him to come to stop me. He didn't know he was doing exactly what I wanted him to do, and for this I could hate myself forever. I always told them I was from Chicago, which was true to an extent. Before I found myself in Carbondale at 17, I indeed lived in Chicago. We moved downstate to be closer to the hospital my father received treatments at. But not in 1917. We were from 2017, that was my home. I never divulged this to my found family, or anyone else. It hadn't fully registered with me at first. It was too surreal to understand, let alone explain. It took months for me to accept the reality I had somehow been thrust 100 years into the past. I initially attributed everything to a vivid fever dream or perhaps trauma-induced hallucination. But after living through 7 years of every fine detail, there was no denying the truth. I traveled, better yet, I fell backward in time. In 2017, after my father's passing left me with nothing to live for, a shimmer of light appeared near our country house. I stepped into it, expecting oblivion, only to wake up in 1917. It was a shocking experience, one I struggled to come to terms with for years. But eventually, I'd figure it all out. I even excelled pretty well where I thought I'd find nothing but failure. I watched as he tied his horse to a nearby fence and explained. I found out that after the eclipse of 2017, there was There is going to be another eclipse in 2024. On this date in 2024. In 100 years and 1 minute to be exact. He finished his chore and checked the reign's tightness before looking at me with the scared look he always gave me when I talked about things he didn't understand. "Are you okay?" he asked. I didn't answer, though he deserved to know. I didn't want to scare him. Didn't want to worry his parents. But I've succeeded in doing both. I could see through the wrinkles on his face how they would also be looking at me at this moment if they were there beside him. Not as the grown man esquire with his name printed on a glass door. Not as the man who has successfully argued many tough cases in both Jackson and Williamson counties, but as the lost child who came for help when he needed it most. I was a genius at running my mouth, yet I couldn't find the words to explain to him why we stood on the side of this road. I couldn't explain to him why I obsessed over this location. The ideas weren't entirely foreign to him, but I also didn't have the ability to explain. As I finished this circular thought for the millionth time, a soccer ball-sized light began to grow in the same spot it had before. He couldn't see it, but to me it was a brilliant beacon, impossible to miss. Tears welded in the corners of my eyes when I realized my theory was right. There, after such a long time, I would find my way home. I took his hand and said, "Come with me?" A question I daydreamed of asking him ever since the day we met. I knew his fear was not only of the unknown, but perhaps also of me. Yet, despite his trepidation, he agreed, and together we stepped into the swirling light. I was ready to face whatever lay on the other side. He had no idea we were going anywhere at all. In the blink of an eye, 100 years passed as we stepped into the future. I always imagined this moment with a sense of adventure, but as I looked at him, all I saw was fear etched into his features. It reminded me of when I first found myself falling back in time. It wasn't adventure I sought. It was death. I believed whatever awaited me on the other side would be the end of the sad, lonely life I resigned myself to. My parents were only children, and when my father passed away, I found myself entirely alone in the world. The only surviving relatives I had were my father's cousin and his children. They were people I barely knew, and who knew even less about me. Yet here I was, standing in the future, alive and well, with him by my side. Quickly I removed my hat, realizing it made my suit look more striking, and then I gently took off his cap, running my fingers through his feathered hair. Even in his fear, he was still beautiful, and I couldn't help but marvel at him. He looked at me with concern, and I handed him his hat, allowing him to hold on to it as if it were his own decision. There was no time to explain the changes in fashion. I myself hadn't been around long enough to witness them fully. The shimmering light continued to grow as the eclipse drew nearer. With 15 minutes left before total moon cover, I tore my gaze away from the light to take in the sight of the huge blue house which loomed in the distance. It was a house I hadn't seen in 7 years. A house that didn't exist yet in 1924. Back then, this area was little more than a farm, cultivated sporadically every few years. There was still an old fence where 100 years earlier, Joe tied his horse. Taking his trembling hand in mine, I began to lead him towards the front lawn of the grand house. If we were to stay there, things would be easier for him. Things would be easier for both of us. Though I wasn't the sharpest when it came to history, I knew about the Great Depression, World War II, and the struggles that Joe, being of Roma descent, might face in this unfamiliar world. But as we walked towards our uncertain future, I vowed to do everything in my power to ensure he would never have to face those struggles alone. I was grateful for the family who made me into the man I was. I never wanted to leave them. I didn't want to. But where did I belong? When did I belong? In the front yard, we interrupted a family of 4 who were gathered to see the eclipse, wearing cardboard glasses meant for viewing the phenomenon. A man, woman, and 2 small children. The startled mother immediately scanned the road, searching for the car she hadn't heard arrive. But it was the father who locked eyes with me, his gaze unwavering. Even after 7 years of absence, he recognized in my face what I could barely recognize in myself anymore. In my eyes, he saw how I was related to these people, still connected to 2024. But it was all wrong. The familiarity I craved for so long was more foreign than I remembered. I shook my head in disbelief. "Brian?" I ventured, needing confirmation. He nodded solemnly, a silent acknowledgement of the truth we both knew. The wife ushered the children to the side yard, sensing the tension in the air, while Brian and I stood facing each other, 100 questions hanging unspoken between us. After all this time, I learned Brian's father moved them into the house shortly after my disappearance. 2 years later, his father passed away. It was then I explained Brian and I were cousins, though the realization seemed to add another layer of weight to the already heavy atmosphere. After years of finally meeting someone I was related to, Joe was left with more questions than he began with. Joe remained silent since our arrival, a palpable sense of panic clinging to him like a shadow. He hadn't let go of my hand since we jumped forward in time, and I didn't mind. The world around us may not have changed much in 100 years, but by the lack of reaction to our intertwined fingers alone, he must have known we were in a different time altogether. Then Brian dropped a bombshell. None of our belongings were discarded. All my possessions were still stored in plastic totes in the garage, untouched and preserved over the years. The news sent a surge of conflicting emotions coursing through me. I longed to rush into the garage and retrieve my old memories, to hold them close and feel their weight in my hands once more. But more than anything, I felt the trembling hand in mine, the scared person who clung to me not only in this time, but also in our past. I made a promise to myself to navigate life with him by my side. I would protect him from the unknown and to cherish every moment, no matter the time or place. As one of Brian's children called out from the side yard, "Look, Daddy, it's starting." Everything around us plunged into darkness. The eclipse had begun, casting a shadow over the land. I glanced towards the road and saw the shimmer of light grew to the size of a car, though I was still the only one who could perceive it. His grip tightened around mine, his fear almost palpable in the dim light. Turning to Brian, I felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I reassured him I hadn't returned to reclaim anything from him. As an attorney, I could imagine what hoops he and his father jumped through to remain there. He surely invested a lot of time and money in making this house his home, and I had no desire to disrupt that. This was his home now, and I no longer belonged there. All I wanted was to bid farewell and allow him to dispose of mine and my father's belongings as he saw fit. Then, almost as an afterthought, I glanced upwards. Joe's eyes followed mine, and I quickly squeezed my lids shut while pulling his face down away from the damaging rays. But I didn't need to see it to know the eclipse was at totality. The tear between my two worlds was at its widest. With a gentle squeeze of his hand, I led him back towards the road, towards the mysterious light only I could see. I could only imagine what Brian must have been thinking as he watched us disappear into the unknown. To him, we must have seemed like specters, appearing from nowhere and vanishing into the darkness. But I hoped that seeing us happily depart would bring him some measure of closure, even if it was a delusion on my part. If I learned anything from my time-traveling escapades, it was that dwelling on the uncertainties of the future was futile. I made my choice, and now it was time to embrace the journey ahead. Before Joe vomited behind my automobile, he tried to hide from me, but I wouldn't turn away from him. I rubbed his back in silent support. I gave him the handkerchief from my breast pocket, as 1924 left me without any minted gum or bottled water to offer. It took the better part of the next hour to calm him down, to help both of us come to terms with the brief yet profoundly impactful journey we made together. I found solace in the knowledge that whatever pulled him through also bolstered my own resolve. We were in this together, for better or for worse. Eventually, he regained enough composure to mount his horse, and I followed behind as we made our way back to town. I couldn't help but feel a fierce protective instinct towards him and his family. If I had the power, I would shield them from every hardship life could throw their way. But the truth was, 2024 offered no guarantees of financial stability or freedom from the struggles of racism and war, which still plagued society. I couldn't save them from their inevitable fates, the same end which awaited us all. There was no promise of a better future as good as my life in the past was. I learned to find comfort in the happiness of those I cared for. Though I wished I had a better grasp of history, perhaps the ability to leverage my knowledge for financial gain, I understood the future we would create would be shaped by our own actions and decisions. I cherished my life where I belonged, unable to imagine feeling the same way about the life I left behind. Every time I looked into his eyes, I knew without a doubt I made the right decision. Our love, our bond, transcended time itself, anchoring me to a sense of purpose and belonging I never knew before. And as we arrived back at the Woodhouse in time for dinner, I found comfort in the knowledge that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. I looked around the table at all their faces, but my primary focus was on Joe. This was where I wanted to be. And finally there, after such a long time, I found my way home.